The emergency broadcast cut through the void like a knife through silk, its desperate frequency crackling across the star lanes with the kind of urgency that made every communication officer in the sector sit up and take notice. The message was simple, terrifying, and broadcast on every known channel simultaneously. This is Research Station Kepler 442b calling all ships, all stations, all worlds. We are under attack. Unknown hostiles have breached our defenses. They're not responding to any communication attempts. They're killing everything. All our researchers, all our staff. Please, anyone who can hear this, we need immediate assistance. The creatures are unlike anything we've ever encountered. They seem to feed on terror itself. This is Director Sarah Chen, and if anyone receives this transmission, please know that we tried to. The transmission cut to static, then silence. Across the galaxy, dozens of species received the broadcast. The Altarian Council debated for 3 standard hours before deciding to send a diplomatic probe. The Zephyrian Trade Union calculated the cost-benefit ratio of mounting a rescue operation and determined it wasn't profitable. The Centaurian Republic scheduled a committee meeting for the following week to discuss potential responses. But there was one group that didn't debate, didn't calculate, and didn't schedule meetings. The Terran Defense Force had been conducting routine patrol exercises in the Outer Rim when the distress call reached them. Commander Jake Morrison was reviewing tactical reports in his ready room aboard the TDF Retribution when his communications officer's voice crackled through the intercom. "Commander, you need to hear this. Emergency broadcast from Kepler 442b. It's bad, sir." Morrison, a grizzled veteran of the Proxima Wars, had heard plenty of distress calls in his 20-year career. But something in Lieutenant Chen's voice told him this one was different. He made his way to the bridge, where the 40-person crew of the heavy cruiser was already buzzing with activity. "Play it back," Morrison ordered. As the transmission played, Morrison watched his crew's faces. These were hardened soldiers, men and women who had seen combat across a dozen worlds. But as Director Chen's voice filled the bridge, describing creatures that fed on terror, he saw something he rarely witnessed in his people's eyes: fear. "Sir," called out his tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes, "we're not the only ones who received this. Long-range sensors are picking up movement from several sectors. The Altarians are mobilizing something, and the Zephyrians have dispatched a scout ship." Morrison nodded grimly. In the galactic community, humans were known as Deathworlders, a term that had started as an insult but had become a badge of honor. Earth, with its extreme weather, deadly wildlife, and constant natural disasters, had produced a species that other races considered borderline insane in their willingness to face danger. "How long to reach Kepler 442b?" Morrison asked. 18 hours at maximum burn, sir," replied his navigator, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson. Morrison looked around his bridge. 40 people against an unknown threat that had apparently wiped out an entire research station. The smart play would be to wait for backup, coordinate with the other responding forces, maybe even wait for the Altarians to take the lead. But Research Station Kepler 442b housed over 300 researchers from a dozen different species. If even a fraction of them were still alive, every minute counted. "All hands, this is the captain," Morrison announced over the ship's intercom. "We've received a distress call from Kepler 442b. Unknown hostiles have attacked the research station. We're going in hot and fast. I won't lie to you, we don't know what we're facing, but we know people are dying. We've never backed down from a fight, and we're not starting now. Battle stations. We burn for Kepler 442b in 10 minutes. The response was immediate. Across the ship, men and women rushed to their stations. The Retribution's fusion engines roared to life, and the ship leaped forward into hyperspace, leaving a trail of blue fire in its wake. 18 hours later, the Retribution dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. What they found made even the most battle-hardened Marines take a step back. The research station, which should have been a gleaming structure of metal and glass orbiting the system's habitable planet, was dark. Not just powered down, completely dark, as if every light source had been extinguished. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what surrounded it. Jesus Christ, whispered Lieutenant Hayes, staring at her tactical display. "Sir, you need to see this." Morrison moved to stand behind her station. The sensors showed the research station, but around it, space itself seemed to be wrong. Dark tendrils of something that wasn't quite matter extended from the station like the arms of some cosmic octopus, reaching out into the void. "What am I looking at?" Morrison asked. "I don't know, sir. The sensors are having trouble getting a clear reading. It's like whatever's out there is interfering with our instruments." "But sir..." Hayes paused, her voice dropping. "I'm detecting life signs. Faint ones. There are still people alive on that station." Morrison felt his jaw tighten. "How many?" "Hard to say. Maybe 50, maybe 100. They're scattered throughout the station, but the signals are weak." "Sir, I'm also detecting something else." "What?" "Movement. Whatever those things are around the station, they're moving. And they're big. Really big." Morrison studied the display for a long moment. The smart play was still to wait for backup. The Altarian diplomatic probe was probably still 3 days out, and God knew when the other species would actually mount a response. But there were people dying on that station. And if the creatures really did feed on terror, then every moment of delay was another moment of unimaginable suffering for the survivors. "Take us in," Morrison ordered. Red alert. All hands to battle stations. The Retribution moved deeper into the system, its weapons systems coming online. The ship's heavy pulse cannons swiveled to track potential threats, while the missile batteries loaded their deadliest ordnance. As they approached the station, the true horror of the situation became clear. The research station hadn't just been attacked, it had been transformed. The dark tendrils that extended from it weren't separate entities, but extensions of the station itself. The metal had been corrupted, twisted into organic-looking shapes that pulsed with a sickly bioluminescence. "Sir," called out Ensign Rodriguez from the communications station, "I'm picking up sounds from the station. It's like screaming, but not quite human." Morrison nodded grimly. "Can you clean up the signal?" "I can try, sir." The bridge speakers crackled to life, and what came through made everyone present wish they hadn't asked. It was screaming, but not just human screaming. There were other voices mixed in, the chittering of Altarian speech, the harmonic tones of Zephyrian communication, and other sounds that didn't correspond to any known species. But underlying it all was something else. A sound that seemed to reach into the minds of everyone who heard it and trigger their deepest, most primal fears. "Cut the audio," Morrison ordered sharply. Several of his crew members were starting to look pale, and he could see hands shaking at their stations. "Sir," Hayes reported, "I'm detecting weapons fire inside the station. Small arms, mostly. It looks like some of the survivors are still fighting." Morrison made his decision. "Launch the shuttles. Marines, full combat load. We're going in." "Sir," Hayes protested, "we don't know what we're dealing with." "Maybe we should." "Lieutenant Commander," Morrison interrupted, "there are people on that station who are still alive, still fighting. We don't abandon our own. We don't abandon anyone." Hayes nodded, properly chastened. "Yes, sir. Marines are ready for deployment." Morrison looked around his bridge one more time. "I'm leading the boarding party. Commander Hayes, you have the ship. If something happens to us, you wait for the Altarians and brief them on what we found. Sir, with respect, you should stay with the ship. Let the Marines handle the boarding." Morrison shook his head. "Those people have been fighting for their lives for God knows how long. They deserve to see that someone came for them. And if we're walking into hell, then I'm going to be right there with my people." The Retribution's shuttle bay was a scene of controlled chaos. 24 Marines in full combat armor checked their weapons while medical personnel prepared emergency treatment stations. The shuttle itself had been configured for combat insertion, with additional armor plating and enhanced weapons systems. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the Marine Squad leader, approached Morrison as he donned his own armor. Sir, we've loaded armor-piercing rounds, plasma charges, and some of the new sonic disruptors. If these things really do feed on fear, maybe the sonic weapons will have an effect.
Morrison nodded. Good thinking, Sergeant. What's our approach? We'll dock with the station's main airlock. According to the schematics, that should put us in the central hub.
From there, we can sweep the station level by level, looking for survivors.
And if we encounter these creatures?
Santos grinned, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Then we give them a taste of what Deathworlders are really capable of, sir. The shuttle launched from the Retribution's bay and crossed the void toward the Twisted Research Station. As they approached, Morrison could see through the viewport that the station's hull was covered in what looked like veins, pulsing, organic structures that definitely hadn't been part of the original design.
Jesus, muttered one of the Marines. It's like the whole station is alive. Stay focused, Morrison ordered. We're here to rescue survivors, not to gawk at the scenery.
The shuttle docked with the station's main airlock, and Morrison felt the familiar thump as the docking clamps engaged.
But something was wrong.
The airlock should have been pressurized, but his suit's sensors were showing a complete vacuum on the other side. Sir, reported the shuttle pilot, I'm not getting any response from the station's docking system.
It's like the whole thing is dead. Morrison checked his weapon one more time. Then we do this the hard way.
Marines, prepare for vacuum insertion. The airlock cycled, and Morrison led his team into the station. What they found was worse than he had imagined. The corridor that should have been a sterile, well-lit passage was instead a nightmare of twisted metal and organic growths. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with life, and a thin mist filled the air that made Morrison's environmental sensors go haywire.
Sir, whispered one of the Marines, do you hear that? Morrison listened.
Beneath the sound of their own breathing and the hum of their equipment, he could hear something else. A low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It's like a heartbeat, Santos observed.
Morrison nodded grimly. Stay alert. These things might be able to sense us.
They moved deeper into the station, following the schematics toward the main research levels. But as they progressed, it became clear that the station's layout had been fundamentally altered. Corridors that should have led to laboratories instead opened onto vast chambers filled with the same organic growths they had seen on the hull.
Sir, reported Private Johnson, motion sensors are picking up movement ahead. Multiple contacts, but they're not moving in any pattern I recognize.
Morrison held up his hand, and the squad stopped.
Through the twisted corridor ahead, they could see shapes moving in the dim light.
They were roughly humanoid, but wrong in ways that made the mind recoil.
Survivors? Asked Santos quietly.
Morrison studied the shapes through his scope. They moved with a shambling gait, but there was something coordinated about their movements. And when one of them turned toward their position, Morrison saw that its face was a twisted amalgamation of features from different species.
No, he said grimly. Not survivors. Open fire. The corridor erupted in weapons fire.
Pulse rounds and plasma charges lit up the darkness, and the creatures ahead let out screams that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the brain. But the Marines pressed forward, their training taking over. The first creature fell to a burst of armor-piercing rounds, but as it died, it seemed to dissolve into a dark mist that immediately began reforming.
Morrison watched in horror as the mist coalesced into two smaller versions of the original creature. They're adapting. Santos shouted over the weapons fire. Every time we kill one, it makes more.
Morrison quickly reassessed the situation.
Standard tactics weren't going to work against enemies that could replicate themselves.
But something Santos had said earlier gave him an idea. Switch to sonic disruptors, he ordered.
If these things feed on fear, maybe sound will disrupt whatever process they use.
The Marines switched weapons, and the corridor filled with the high-pitched whine of sonic disruptors. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The creatures stopped their advance, seeming to writhe in pain. More importantly, when they died, they stayed dead. It works, called out Private Chen.
The sonic weapons are disrupting their regeneration. Morrison felt a surge of hope. Good. Form up and advance. We need to find those survivors. They fought their way deeper into the station, encountering more of the transformed creatures with each level. But the sonic disruptors proved effective, and Morrison's Marines were nothing if not adaptable. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, covering each other's advances and establishing secure positions as they went. Finally, they reached what had once been the station's main laboratory. The heavy blast doors were sealed, but Morrison could hear weapons fire from inside. "Survivors," he said with satisfaction. "Sergeant Santos, get those doors open." Santos placed shaped charges on the blast door's hinges while the rest of the squad provided security. The explosion that followed was small but precise, and the doors fell inward with a crash. What they found inside made Morrison's heart skip a beat. The laboratory had been turned into a fortress. Overturned tables and equipment had been arranged into defensive positions, and behind them, Morrison could see figures in environmental suits firing at something in the shadows. But these weren't just any figures, they were researchers from a dozen different species, working together in a coordinated defense. "This is Commander Morrison, Terran Defense Force," he called out. "We're here to help." The weapons fire from the defensive positions stopped, and a figure in a damaged environmental suit approached. Morrison could see through the faceplate that it was a human woman, her face streaked with exhaustion and fear. "Commander Morrison," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you real? We've been fighting for so long. Some of us started seeing things that weren't there." Morrison removed his helmet, showing his face. "I'm real, Doctor. We received your distress call. How many survivors do you have?" 43, she replied, and Morrison could hear the weight of loss in her voice. "We started with 312. The creatures, they came from nowhere. They infected the station's systems, started changing everything. Anyone they caught, they transformed them." Morrison looked around the makeshift fortress. The survivors were a mix of species, humans, Altarians, Zephyrians, and others he didn't immediately recognize. But they all had the same look in their eyes, the hollow stare of people who had seen too much horror. "What are these things?" Morrison asked. The woman, who Morrison now recognized as Director Chen from the distress call, shook her head. "We don't know. They appeared 3 days ago, just materialized out of nowhere. They seem to be some kind of parasitic organism, but they're unlike anything in our databases. They feed on fear, terror, despair. The more frightened their victims become, the stronger they get." Morrison nodded, pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. "That's why the sonic disruptors work. They disrupt the fear response." "Sonic disruptors?" Chen asked hopefully. "You found a way to fight them?" "We found a way to kill them," Morrison corrected. "But we need to get you all out of here. My ship is standing by for evacuation." Chen looked around at the other survivors. "Some of us are injured. Dr. Thresh over there has been keeping us alive, but he's exhausted. And we've been fighting for so long." Morrison placed a hand on her shoulder. "Doctor, you've done amazingly well. But it's time to let us take over. My Marines will secure a path to the shuttle bay. We'll have you off this station within the hour." But as if the universe wanted to mock his confidence, the lights in the laboratory suddenly went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. "That's not good," muttered Santos. "Sir, something's interfering with the station's power systems." Morrison activated his comm unit. "Retribution, this is Morrison. Report." Hayes's voice crackled through the static. "Sir, we're seeing massive energy spikes from the station. It's like the whole structure is waking up. And sir, those dark tendrils around the station are moving. They're reaching out toward us." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. "How long until they reach you?" "At current rate of expansion, maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes to evacuate 43 people through a station that was apparently coming alive around them." Morrison had faced long odds before, but this was pushing the limits even for a Deathworlder. All right, people, we're moving now, Morrison announced. Survivors, grab whatever you can carry. Marines, we're going to escort these people to the shuttle bay. Anyone who can't keep up gets carried.
The evacuation began immediately. Morrison's Marines formed a protective corridor while the survivors gathered their essential equipment. But as they prepared to move out, Private Johnson, who had been monitoring the perimeter, called out a warning.
Sir, we've got movement in the corridors.
Multiple contacts, coming from all directions.
Morrison looked at his tactical display.
The creatures were converging on their position from every direction. It was like they had somehow sensed the rescue attempt and were mobilizing to stop it.
It's a trap, Chen said quietly.
They were waiting for someone to come for us.
Using us as bait.
Morrison studied the tactical situation. The direct route to the shuttle bay was completely blocked, and the alternate routes were being cut off one by one. But there was one possibility.
Dr. Chen, what's below this level?
The station's main reactor.
But it's been compromised.
The creatures have been using it as some kind of nursery. Morrison felt his blood run cold.
Nursery?
They're breeding down there.
Creating more of themselves. We estimate there are thousands of them in the reactor chamber. Thousands. Morrison did the math in his head.
Even with the sonic disruptors, his small team couldn't fight through thousands of creatures.
But maybe they didn't have to. What would happen if the reactor went critical? Morrison asked. Chen's eyes widened.
The explosion would destroy the station. Everything within a 50-kilometer radius would be vaporized.
Morrison nodded grimly. And how do we trigger a reactor overload? Commander, you can't be serious, Santos protested. We'd never make it out in time. Morrison looked around at the survivors. 43 people who had somehow managed to survive 3 days of hell.
They deserved better than to die as breeding stock for cosmic parasites.
Dr. Chen, how do we overload the reactor?
Chen hesitated for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. The containment field has manual overrides.
If we could get to the reactor control room, we could shut down the magnetic containment.
The reactor would go critical in about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, Morrison repeated. That's enough time to reach the shuttle bay.
If we can fight our way through thousands of creatures, Santos added darkly.
Morrison activated his comm unit. Retribution, this is Morrison. We're going to overload the station's reactor.
Be ready for immediate dust-off when we reach the shuttle bay. Sir, Hayes's voice was tight with worry, those tendrils are getting closer.
If they reach us before you get back.
Then you break orbit and get clear, Morrison ordered.
That's a direct order, Commander Hayes. If we don't make it back, you warn the galaxy about what's down here. Sir, aye. That's an order, Hayes. Morrison out.
Morrison turned to address the combined group of Marines and survivors.
All right, people, here's the plan. We're going to split into 3 groups. Team 1 will create a distraction on the upper levels, drawing the creatures away from the reactor. Team 2 will escort the survivors to the shuttle bay. Team 3 will go to the reactor control room and trigger the overload.
Sir, Santos spoke up, I should lead Team 3.
You're needed with the survivors. Morrison shook his head. No, Sergeant. I'm going to the reactor.
You're the best tactical mind I have, I need you leading the escort team. Santos looked like she wanted to argue, but Morrison's expression made it clear the decision was final.
Volunteers for Team 3? Morrison asked. Half the Marines stepped forward.
Morrison selected 2 of them, Private Chen and Corporal Williams, both demolitions experts who would be useful if they encountered complications.
All right, people, let's move out. We'll rendezvous at the shuttle bay in 9 minutes.
If we're not there, you leave without us. The 3 teams moved out simultaneously. Morrison could hear the sounds of combat echoing through the station as Team 1 engaged the creatures on the upper levels. The distraction was working, the corridors toward the reactor were clearer than they had been. But as Morrison and his two Marines descended deeper into the station, the environment around them became increasingly hostile. The walls were covered in the same organic growths, but here they were thicker, more mature. And the sound of that cosmic heartbeat was getting stronger. "Sir," whispered Private Chen, "my environmental sensors are going crazy. The air down here is thick with some kind of spores." Morrison checked his own readings. She was right, the atmosphere was contaminated with something that didn't appear in any database. "Keep your suits sealed. Don't breathe any of this stuff." They reached the reactor level, and Morrison had to fight down a wave of nausea at what he saw. The reactor chamber, which should have been a clean, sterile environment, had been transformed into something that looked like the inside of a living organism. The walls pulsed with veins of dark energy, and in the center of the chamber, where the reactor should have been, there was a massive organic structure that seemed to be feeding on the station's power. And around it, hundreds of creatures were moving in a coordinated pattern, tending to what looked like eggs or cocoons. "Jesus Christ," muttered Corporal Williams. "It's like they're farming." Morrison studied the scene through his scope. The creatures were focused on their work, but there were too many to fight through directly. However, the reactor control room was on the opposite side of the chamber, and there was a maintenance catwalk that ran along the ceiling. "We go over the top," Morrison decided. "Stay quiet, move fast, and don't engage unless we have to." They made their way to the maintenance access and began crawling along the catwalk. Below them, the creatures continued their work, seemingly unaware of the intruders above. Morrison could see that the organic structure in the center of the chamber was actually a perverted version of the station's reactor. The creatures had somehow merged their biology with the technology, creating a hybrid that was part machine, part living organism. Halfway across the chamber, Private Chen's foot slipped on the catwalk, and a piece of debris fell toward the creatures below. Morrison watched in horror as one of the creatures looked up, its twisted face scanning the ceiling. For a moment, Morrison thought they had been discovered. But then the creature returned to its work, apparently dismissing the debris as unimportant. They reached the control room, and Morrison was relieved to find it relatively untouched by the organic growths. The reactor controls were still functional, showing the current status of the hybrid system below. "Can you shut it down?" Morrison asked Private Chen, who was the team's technical expert. Chen studied the controls for a moment. "I can override the containment field, but sir, once I do this, there's no going back. The reactor will go critical in exactly 10 minutes. Morrison checked his chronometer. Team 2 should be reaching the shuttle bay in about 5 minutes. That would give them a small buffer, but not much. "Do it," Morrison ordered. Chen's fingers flew over the controls. Warning lights began flashing throughout the control room, and Morrison could hear alarms starting to sound in the distance. "It's done," Chen reported. 10 minutes to critical overload. But as if the creatures had suddenly realized what was happening, the chamber below erupted in activity. The hundreds of creatures that had been tending to the hybrid reactor suddenly looked up toward the control room, their faces twisted with rage. "They know," Williams said grimly. "They're coming for us." Morrison looked at the chamber below. The creatures were already starting to climb toward the control room, their claws digging into the metal walls. There was no way to reach the catwalk without fighting through them. "New plan," Morrison said. "We hold this position. Keep them away from the controls until the reactor goes critical." "Sir," Chen protested, "we'll never survive 10 minutes against that many creatures." Morrison checked his weapon and smiled grimly. "Then we'd better make every shot count." The first creatures reached the control room, and Morrison's team opened fire with their sonic disruptors. The creatures fell screaming, their forms dissolving into mist. But there were hundreds more behind them, and they kept coming. Morrison lost track of time as the battle raged. The small control room became a killing field, with the 3 Marines fighting back-to-back against wave after wave of creatures. His sonic disruptor overheated, and he switched to conventional weapons, then to his sidearm when the rifle ran dry. "Sir," gasped Private Chen, "how much time left?" Morrison checked his chronometer. 3 minutes. But even as he spoke, Morrison realized they had a problem. The creatures weren't just trying to reach the controls, they were trying to reach the hybrid reactor itself. If they could somehow repair the containment field, they might be able to prevent the overload.
Williams, Chen, we need to get down there. Stop them from reaching the reactor.
The two Marines looked at him like he had lost his mind. Sir, there are still dozens of them down there.
Morrison nodded grimly. Then we'd better move fast.
They fought their way out of the control room and down toward the reactor chamber. Morrison's team was down to their last few sonic disruptor charges, and they had to make each shot count. The creatures seemed to sense that their time was running out, and they attacked with desperate fury.
Morrison reached the hybrid reactor just as several creatures were attempting to interface with its organic components.
He opened fire, cutting them down, but more kept coming.
Sir, called out Chen, 1 minute to overload.
Morrison looked around the chamber. There were still dozens of creatures between them and the exit. Even if they started running now, they might not make it to the shuttle bay in time. But then he heard the most beautiful sound in the galaxy, the roar of shuttle engines.
This is Santos, crackled his comm unit. Sir, we're coming in hot.
The survivors are secure, but we've got company. Morrison looked up to see the shuttle burst through the chamber's ceiling, its weapons blazing. The creatures scattered as pulse cannon fire lit up the chamber.
30 seconds. Chen shouted.
Morrison and his team ran for the shuttle as its cargo ramp lowered. Behind them, the hybrid reactor began to pulse with unstable energy, and the creatures' screams reached a crescendo. They dove into the shuttle just as Santos pulled up and away from the station. Through the viewport, Morrison could see the station beginning to tear itself apart as the reactor went critical.
Retribution, this is Santos. We have the commander and all survivors. Clear the area, now.
The shuttle burst out of the station's superstructure and into open space, where the Retribution was waiting. But the dark tendrils that had been reaching for the ship were now retracting, pulled back toward the station as it prepared to explode.
All hands, brace for impact, Hayes announced over the comm. The station's reactor finally went critical, and the explosion lit up the entire system.
The shockwave hit the Retribution moments later, but the ship's shields held. When the light faded, there was nothing left of the research station or the creatures that had infested it. Morrison found himself in the shuttle's medical bay, where Dr. Thresh was examining the human survivors.
The alien physician looked exhausted, but his large eyes showed relief.
Commander Morrison, Thresh said in his melodic voice, I wanted to thank you. Without your intervention, we would all have perished.
Morrison nodded. How are the survivors doing? Physically, they will recover. Psychologically, it will take time.
What they experienced was beyond normal trauma.
But they are alive, and that is what matters.
Morrison looked around the medical bay at the faces of the survivors. They were from a dozen different species, but they all shared the same expression, the look of people who had stared into the abyss and somehow managed to climb back out.
Dr. Thresh, Morrison said, what do you think those creatures were? The alien physician was quiet for a long moment.
I believe they were something that evolved specifically to prey on spacefaring civilizations. They appeared just as our research was reaching a breakthrough in understanding dark energy. I think they were attracted by our progress, our fear of the unknown.
Morrison felt a chill. Are there more of them out there? I do not know. But Commander, if there are, I believe you humans may be our best defense against them. Morrison raised an eyebrow. How so?
Thresh made a sound that Morrison had learned was the Eltarian equivalent of a chuckle. Because, Commander, you are the only species we know that responds to fear not by running away, but by running toward it. When the rest of the galaxy heard our distress call, they debated and calculated and formed committees.
But you humans heard it and immediately came to help.
Morrison looked out the viewport at the expanding debris field that had once been the research station.
We couldn't leave you to face that alone.
No, Thresh agreed.
You could not.
And that is why, if these creatures return, I believe the galaxy will look to the Deathworlders for salvation. Later, as the Retribution made its way back to Terran space, Morrison found himself on the bridge with Commander Hayes. The official after-action reports had been filed, and the survivors were being cared for by the medical team.
Sir, Hayes said, we've been receiving communications from across the galaxy.
Word of what happened at Kepler 442b is spreading. The Altarian Council wants to meet with Terran Command. The Zephyrians are offering trade agreements.
Even the Centaurians are talking about a mutual defense pact. Morrison nodded.
What about the survivors?
They're being hailed as heroes.
Several of them have been invited to speak at the Galactic Science Council about their experiences.
Dr. Chen has been offered a position heading up a new xenobiology research program.
Morrison was quiet for a moment, staring out at the stars.
Commander, do you think Dr. Thresh was right?
Are there more of those creatures out there?
Hayes shrugged. I don't know, sir. But if there are, at least now the galaxy knows they can be fought.
And they know who to call when they need someone willing to fight them.
Morrison smiled grimly.
The Deathworlders.
The Deathworlders, Hayes agreed.
As the Retribution continued its journey home, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter with the creatures was just the beginning. The galaxy was a vast place, filled with wonders and terrors that no single species could comprehend. But for the first time in his career, Morrison felt like humanity had found its place in that galaxy. They were the ones who ran toward the darkness when everyone else ran away. They were the ones who heard the screams in the void and answered them. They were the Deathworlders, and the galaxy was starting to understand what that really meant. 3 months later, Morrison stood in the briefing room of Terran Command's headquarters, looking at a holographic display of the galaxy. Red dots marked the locations of reported sightings of creatures similar to those they had encountered at Kepler 442b.
There were 17 confirmed sightings, and more reports coming in every day.
The situation is escalating, reported Admiral Patricia Stone, the head of Terran Command. The creatures seem to be probing our defenses, testing our responses.
Intelligence suggests they're building towards something bigger. Morrison studied the display. What do we know about their capabilities? Limited, Stone admitted. But we've learned a few things. They seem to be drawn to areas of high technological development.
They feed on fear and terror, but they also seem to be studying us, learning from each encounter.
Morrison nodded. And the other species?
The Altarians have committed to a joint defense force.
The Zephyrians are providing funding and logistics.
Even the Centaurians are talking about contributing ships.
But Morrison.
Stone's expression grew serious. They're all looking to us to lead. Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders.
Why us? Because, Stone said simply, we're the only ones who aren't afraid of them.
Oh, we're scared. Anyone with half a brain would be scared of those things.
But we're not paralyzed by that fear. We can function in spite of it. Morrison looked around the briefing room at his fellow officers.
They were all veterans of various conflicts, men and women who had seen combat across the galaxy. But this was different. This was a threat to all sentient life, and somehow, humanity had become the galaxy's protector.
What's our next move? Morrison asked.
Stone gestured to the holographic display.
We're forming a rapid response fleet. 12 ships, all armed with sonic disruptors and crewed by volunteers from across the galaxy.